Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us to mark the United Nations International Day of Persons with Disability. My name is Millie Kennelly. I am a middle-aged woman with long brown hair, red glasses, a black t-shirt and white cardigan. I am from the Griffith Business School, and I would like to welcome you on behalf of the Griffith Business School Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Committee, Inclusive Futures, Reimagining Disability, and the Hopkins Centre. Today I am presenting in front of a backdrop featuring the logos of these organisations with the slogan, Bold Ideas, Better Solutions. Today's online session will focus on fostering disability inclusive societies for advancing social progress, which is the United Nations 2025 theme. But we will be discussing this with a Queensland flavour as we look ahead to the 2032 Brisbane Olympic and Paralympic Games. Before we begin today's proceedings, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet. I am working today on the lands of the Kumbameri people of the Gold Coast region, and I would like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and to extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us today. We have a few quick housekeeping items to address. First, live captioning is available for today's session via the Stream Text platform. Please scan the QR code on the slide or access the URL link in the chat window or your registration email to access live captions. If you prefer, auto-generated captions are also available in Microsoft Teams. Please see the chat window for access instructions. Second, we've planned today's event with accessibility and inclusion in mind, but we understand technology is different for everyone. We welcome your feedback on anything we may have overlooked. You can use the chat window or email address on the slide to get in touch with us, and we will do our best to assist. Finally, you can also use the chat window or email address to ask questions of our panel. We will do our best to get to questions at the end of today's session. Please note that today's session is being recorded and the recording will be made available to you after the session. With that, I would like to introduce you to our four panel members. Lisa Cox, OAM, is an author, university researcher, TEDx speaker, and internationally awarded thought leader. Her work is focused on leveraging the power and influence of industries like media and advertising to change social attitudes about disability while positively impacting social outcomes like employment. And Lisa has let us know today that she is experiencing a little bit of technological difficulty, courtesy of Optus. So you may not be able to see her during the session, but she is here. Dr. Maria G is a researcher from the Griffith Business School, researching youth and disability employment, hospitality work, and service worker wellbeing. Bradley Kinsella has an extensive background as a disability and social inclusion champion. He is an adjunct industry fellow at Griffith University and has worked as a senior executive in government for over 26 years. And Associate Professor Poppy Satiriedu is a researcher with the Griffith Business School and international expert in managing high performance sport, equitable sport participation and sports education. I will now hand over to Dr. Kelsey Chapman, who will moderate today's session. Kelsey is a research fellow with Inclusive Futures, Reimagining Disability, whose work explores effective service delivery for people with disability, particularly in transport and health.
Thanks, Millie, for those introductions, and welcome everyone. We are so happy to have you join us on International Day of People with Disability. Before I jump into the session, I just wanted to take a moment to describe myself. I am a 35-year-old woman with shoulder-length dark brown hair. I'm wearing a white top and a cream jacket, and I have the same teal background that Millie described, that has the Hopkins Centre logo and the Griffith University logo on it as well. I will let each of our panel members do a visual description of themselves, but on the screen now are the 4 panel members highlighted so that you can see each one of them on the main part of your screen. I also wanted today to just do an acknowledgement of people with disability who have come before us, the advocates, the valiant people who have enabled all of us to be here together today and speak on this topic. I just thank them for their perseverance and the work that they've done in paving the way for the entire community. I also want to acknowledge people who have come before us and died in institutional settings or who have been silenced by institutional practices. We take on, as this panel, the responsibility to, when we can, speak in an informed and considered manner on those people's behalves, and we just recognize that we are continuing to advocate and agitate for inclusion. So I would like to kick off first by asking each of the panel members, starting with Lisa, to do a visual description of yourself and then respond to our first question, which is, when we talk about advancing social progress through disability inclusion, what does a truly inclusive society look like?
Sure. Thanks so much for that. It's really great to be here. Hello, everyone. My name is Lisa, and I'm a middle-aged woman, blonde hair, shoulder length, white skin, and I'm wearing glasses. I would be, if I was on the screen, also sitting in front of a teal background like the other speakers. Now, in answer to your first question, what does an inclusive community look like? I suppose if we were all in a truly inclusive society, there are so many of us that would be out of work, and that would be a great thing, because at the moment we are educating, advocating, doing all of these things to make a more inclusive society, but it really would be great if I could retire tomorrow, to be honest. And that to me would mean things like architects just making accessible buildings just because it's a no-brainer. Media just includes disability the right way, frames us the correct way because, well, that's the way it's done. Script writers would just automatically include people with disabilities because that's all they know what to do. So obviously the things I'm talking about are quite a way away, but we are making progress in the right direction, I think.
Thanks, Lisa. I think we'd all like to retire, but in the absence of that, we'll keep working, I suppose, if we have to. Brad, I want to pose the same question to you. So when we talk about advancing social progress through inclusion, what does that truly inclusive society look like?
Thank you for the question. For those who may not be able to see me on the screen, my name is Brad. I'm a middle-aged white person with shaved head, clean shaven today, and wearing a maroon shirt, proud Queenslander. The opportunity of speaking today is one that we don't take lightly. Having people with disabilities being accepted in society right across, both from participation, employment and others, is something that's really critical. And I think going into 2032 is an opportunity that will only come around once in a lifetime. Why me? What are the challenges in going forward? I think people with disabilities speak a different language, and we tend to because we come from different backgrounds. But those without disability, they haven't grown up with us. They haven't sat alongside of us, and then yet we expect them to pick it up. So I think part of that challenge is for people with disabilities is to educate and support, not just bring people down and point out all the problems.
And Brad, I wonder if you could talk about some of your experience in helping to build those inclusive societies from within and outside of government.
Look, I've been now playing in this space for 30-something years, and I think the journey has been both personally rewarding, frustrating, those sorts of things. I think it is that balance between finding and supporting people with disabilities so they actually have access to the things that they need to actually make the best possible life they can they can achieve. We were just having a conversation offline before where we talked about that in some countries overseas, I am no longer disabled. So, for example, in Doha or indeed the United Arab Emirates, I'm a person of determination. Now, the reason I use that as an example is because they brought about that fundamental change in those places in under 12 months. So as much as I take my previous colleague's point around, I want to be unemployed, and it not being something in the future, I think we can bring about change that is meaningful, and we can't do it without the people on this connection today.
Thanks, Brad. Yeah, I think that's really important that we want to think both aspirationally, but also what can we be achieving in the short term, because people with disability can't wait and they shouldn't have to either to see this change come about. Maria, I would like to pose the same question to you if you're happy to answer.
Thank you, Kelsey, and hello, everyone. Maria speaking. I am in my mid-30s, fairly slim, with light brown blonde hair and blue eyes. I am wearing cat-eye glasses and a green shirt with white jacket over it. And similar to other presenters, I have a teal background with Hopkins Center as a logo. I come at this question as someone who researches employment and youth employment in particular. So when I picture a truly inclusive society, I start with work. It's a society where a young person with disability grows up expecting to have a real job that pays properly and is not a special program on the side, where the default is not workplaces flex around the workplace has to flex around different bodies and brains rather than people having to contort themselves to fit a rigid job description. And at a deeper level, it's all about dignity. People with disability recognized as co-workers, leaders, business owners, and not just recipients of services. So in short, for me, inclusive society is one where disability is not a predictor of whether you'll get decent work, but where your first job builds your confidence instead of eroding it, and where support is assumed to be part of how we do employment, not an exception we have to fight for. Thank you, Kelsey.
Thanks, Maria. I think that concept of dignity is so important to inclusion. And so I really appreciate that you've raised that. Poppy, now over to you. I'd love to know more about what you think an inclusive society could really look like.
Hi, everyone. I'm Poppy Sotiriadou. I'm in my early 50s with straight shoulder length, dark blonde hair. My hairdresser says it's dirty blonde. I have brown eyes and a bright, warm smile. And today I'm wearing a brown and white linen top with my favorite round gold necklace. And I'm really delighted to be here with you all. And I'm going to tackle this question from a sports perspective. In a recent sport and disability co-creation workshop that was organized by Jackie Lau, the CEO of Sport Matters, people with disabilities said something really simple but powerful. They want to be seen. They want some normalcy in their lives. And that really stuck with me, because a truly inclusive society isn't one where we make room for people with disability. It's one where we expect them to be there. It means our programs, our facilities, our systems, our processes are designed from the start so everyone can take part without needing special permission or extra steps. And moving to the 2032 Olympics, this message is very powerful. And the best examples are everyday ones. It's when someone who uses a wheelchair can roll into their local club on a Saturday morning and join a skill session without anyone scrabbling to make it work. It's when a blind athlete arrives at the gym and the staff are ready and they know how to guide them safely. It's when a young person with an intellectual disability plays in the community league, and the coach just naturally adjusts instructions and the environment without making them feel different. So that's what people told us they want, to participate without fuss, without being singled out, just to feel like they belong. And honestly, that everyday normalcy is, I believe, the real benchmark of an inclusive society.
Thanks, Poppy, and thanks, panel. I think, you know, we've talked about some really high-level concepts to help frame the rest of our conversation today. So, you know, we've heard about systemic expectancy and that idea of economic dignity, media accessibility and physical accessibility, and then, of course, Brad really speaking to empowerment and education towards this sort of normalcy and visibility that Poppy mentioned. When we think about this sort of vision, a society with expectancy, dignity, and seamless action, we kind of can see what that destination might look like, but the reality is the gap between that vision and our current reality is still pretty vast. So I wonder, Maria, if you might start off thinking through what the greatest barriers are that we have to dismantle first to start bridging that gap.
Thank you, Kelsey. I'll answer this from my default lens, of course, the lens of employment, and stigma, discrimination are still widespread, and I do not want to downplay how significant that is still. But I'd like to focus on what happens even in places that are genuinely trying to be inclusive, or programs that are designed to help with transition to work, and while intent is there, there's still certain systemic barriers that keep us getting in the way. So first, there is a job design and that imagination gap. Most workplaces still quietly assume an ideal worker, full-time, endlessly flexible, no support needs, and job descriptions are often written around that person. And if we never question that template, many talented candidates will always look like a risk rather than a resource. Until we normalize flexible and flexing jobs and designing support from the get-go, inclusive employment will always remain the exception. Second barrier is that we often focus on that transitional system that doesn't really transition. There is a lot of evidence right now, positive evidence about supported employment. So traditional vocational rehab, school to work pathways, training programs, they're great. They improve skills, confidence, short-term employment roles, but they're often deficit focused, trying to fix the individual to fit the job, which doesn't always translate, especially doesn't always translate outside of the big cities or controlled environments. And most crucially, we rarely track what happens after the program ends. Do people move into the open, ordinary jobs? Do those jobs last? Are they feeling included? Are they feeling happy long-term? So too often people just cycle through that preparation and transition without really landing into secure and meaningful work. And last, I'm going to mention briefly, perhaps very connected to the previous one, is the fact that the funding architecture rewards churn, not retention. Too often providers are paid for quick placements and short retention milestones, not for walking alongside a person or employer over years. That's how we end up with short stints in those fragile jobs or unpaid placements that often leads to repeated disappointment. So it's expensive for the system, and it's devastating, most importantly, for people's dignity and confidence. So even our best practice models are operating in that system that still often flavor quick fixes over a sustained inclusive career. So there's the big gap we have to address.
Thanks, Maria. And I know that a lot of your work is already agitating for improvements in that area. Brad, I wonder if I could pose that question to you. So that's,
Yep. Thank you again for the question. Look, building on the previous colleague's response, employment is really important and it's a key aspect of many of our lives. That's usually where you meet people. It's usually where you socialise within a normal environment, you meet your partners, you develop friends and connections. As someone who's come from a public policy background, I look at things and go, well, is this a disability issue or not? And then I actually got to the point where I realised it wasn't a disability issue. This is purely about how we run our business. And by business, I mean whatever aspect we're in. You wouldn't go out there and open up a business that actually excluded the majority of your customers, because that's just kind of silly. But that's literally what we're talking about when we talk about accessibility and inclusion, because by the time you add people that look like me in terms of having a physical disability than others, and the people whose disability you can't see, and the aging population, and the young people, we are talking about the majority of society. Like we've got to do better for that generation, and it makes sense. Previously, I think I heard the word, and I'm apologising if I cringed when I heard someone say it, around expense. Well, my issue here is that it's not, it's a big number, but the reason we're doing like NDIS, for example, is about response. But if people have jobs, it actually is a saving to government because they're no longer on pensions. If people have jobs, it means that they're contributing to their future in their old age. If people have jobs, they actually earn money that then spends it. So I think there's a real opportunity here to reframe this conversation to say how we've got a solution to society's problem. And the solution is people with disabilities. You hear all the employers at the moment saying they can't attract workforce and having to go overseas. We've got 20% of the population ready to get up and walk, to work, not walk, sorry, wrong one. But these are the opportunities. Employers go, I don't know how to do that. Again, this goes back to us working with them and using the education and the research and the evaluation tools so we can actually evidence-base what we're talking about.
Thanks, Brad. I think that's a really important reminder that it's not a disability problem, and it's time to start sort of framing these as disability problems. Lisa, I would love to turn to you now, and I wonder, Rosie, if we could share Lisa's slides on the screen to talk more about the barriers and some of the visionary things that you have put together for us.
Sure. So just a bit of background. My background is in marketing and advertising. And so I'm looking at this from a bigger picture in terms of what can we do to change social attitudes and really change the perceptions that society generally has about disability and people with disabilities. And unfortunately, there are all sorts of statistics and other data around to show that people with disabilities aren't getting jobs, aren't getting them promoted, et cetera, because of these horrible stigmas that we have. So instead of just, Einstein famously said, the insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. But the government, unfortunately, when it comes to disability employment, keeps doing the same thing over and over again, throwing money at the problem without addressing the key underlying issues about why we have this poor employment, which, to summarise, is poor social attitudes. So that's something that my research is looking at the moment. And I just thought I'd bring up two examples. The advertising that happened for the Paralympics many, many years ago, if it's up on your screen there, we have the superhumans. Now, at the time, I'm sure the creative team thought they were doing a great thing and people with disabilities, superhuman, isn't this fantastic? The only problem was they didn't consult with the disability community. So the geniuses who came up with this got absolutely slammed, and rightfully so, because everyone has their own perspective on what they think of disability, but for those of you who aren't aware, generally speaking, superhuman, superpower, all of those sorts of things, that's not the sort of language that the disability community wants to use. So we'll just show the next slide. Fortunately, Channel 4 took that on board, and if we can, is the next slide great? They took that on board, and in several years after that, they brought out another campaign, which really just said blatantly, this is what everyone's thinking when they're watching the Paralympics, but few people say it out loud. So, isn't she fast considering? Isn't she good considering she's in a wheelchair? Or aren't they great considering they're disabled? All of those sorts of things. So that campaign got a lot of traction and a lot of applause from disabled and non-disabled people. But the reason I mention this and I'm talking about advertising is that advertising and media are the world's biggest, most influential and powerful mediums that we have to change social attitudes. So yes, we can look at all sorts of things like rails and ramps and accessibility features, but we can have all the rails and ramps in the world, but they mean nothing if every time we go out in public, we're being patronised or pat on the head or spoken to in ableist ways.
Thanks, Lisa. I think those are two amazing examples of the challenge, but also the potential for innovation in that social attitude, dismantling of social attitudinal barriers. Poppy, I wonder if we can quickly come to you to kind of get your sports participation lens over those kind of key systemic barriers that we need to address.
Yeah, thank you. What's interesting is listening the other panel members talking about employability. And over the past 3 years, I've been doing some research on the role of sports and exercise in people with disabilities engaging in sport, and how that can lead to social economic impacts, including transition to workforce and employability. So it really ties in nicely now. And the biggest threat that emerges from the conversation so far is that the biggest barriers aren't individual, they're systemic. And in sport, those barriers show up in two main places: how sports participation is structured and how our organizations operate. So on the participation side, we make great progress with tools like the TREE, which stands for Teaching, Rules, Equipment, and Environment. So that has absolutely opened up doors, but we consistently hear from people with disability that these technical adjustments aren't enough on their own. So the deeper barriers are social and relational. If carers, for example, parents and family members don't understand sport or support sports participation and they're hesitant, the child simply won't get to the venue in the first place. If the spectators, I really like those promotional slides shown earlier, if the spectators stare or comment or make people feel othered, the environment isn't safe. If coaches haven't been trained in disability awareness, they may unintentionally exclude or underestimate participants or athletes. So the first barrier to dismantle is attitudinal, the assumptions and how expectations that still exist in community sport affect us. And the second part that I mentioned earlier is the organizational side, the biggest systemic barrier. Inclusion is still treated like an add-on rather than standard practice. So inclusion is often driven by, it's very common to see one passionate staff member that makes all the difference, and they're the hardworking person, rather than embed those practices across policies, budgets, roles, accreditation for coaches, competition design, and so forth. So organizations need to, again, normalize inclusion, the funding of disability as a core business, the building of disability training into coach and volunteer accreditation, the facilities, the communication, the registrations, the pathways accessible from the start. So ultimately, improving accessibility means broadening our focus beyond the individual. We need to support the whole ecosystem, the carers, the families, the volunteers, the coaches, the administrators, the spectators, the media, to create those environments where participation is positive and safe. And I think tying it back to the Brisbane 2032, to bridge that gap, organizations must treat inclusion as core business, not an optional initiative. We need to design systems that will support people with disability, not just the athletes, to belong and thrive in South East Queensland well beyond the Brisbane 2032 Olympics.
Thanks, Poppy. I think that's a really powerful way for us to finish out that second question and really center the fact that the barriers are systemic, attitudinal, and really rooted in this positioning of inclusion as an add-on rather than fundamental standard practice. We've heard from each of you about some of the kind of early innovations and the early work that you are involved in. So Lisa shared about that media campaign and the shift that both consulting and working with people with disability and also having positive portrayals of people with disability in the media is really an important innovation. And Maria, you talked about some of this vision for what the future of employment might look like and how some of the ideas for how we might get there. And Poppy, you just mentioned, of course, that we need to really center this attitudinal barrier conversation. And Brad, I really appreciated that you started to talk about the fact that, you know, there's a real social solution here where disability inclusion can drive some of these workforce attraction and economic growth pathways. I wonder, based on the kind of barriers we've discussed, if we could transition into, you know, some of these drivers of change. So we often assume that, you know, policy and regulation are the key drivers of change, but everyone's mentioned things that are not really related to policy or regulation. And so I wonder if we might start coming back to you, Lisa, to talk about where you've seen some innovative, creative, non-traditional solutions that are yielding really good inclusive outcomes, and also potentially talk about what some of the risks are as well related to that.
Okay, sure. I guess one of the easiest ways to think about this, when I first acquired my disabilities over 20 years ago, I already had a strong background in advertising, and I was looking around thinking, where is the advertising with disability? There was nothing. There were no talent agencies, nada, in Australia anyway. US and UK were doing a great job. 20 years later, over 20 years later, it's fantastic to see all of the initiatives that are coming out from people all around Australia, talent agencies, programs, workbooks, all of those sorts of things. It's been huge. We still have a long way to go. Now, I love what Brad said at the beginning, that it's not just about pointing out all the problems, that we need to look at solutions as well. So having, I suppose, things that do call people in rather than just call them out, because there are a lot of people like I was over 20 years ago who wanted to do the right thing, wanted to be more inclusive, wanted to include disability, but I didn't know where to start. And I was terrified of saying or doing the wrong thing. So I did nothing. And I'll be the first to admit that was wrong of me. And now I see a lot of businesses out there who are terrified of doing the wrong thing, saying the wrong thing, being called out on social media. So they too are doing nothing. And that's not necessarily the right thing to be doing. So working closer with government and business and industry to hold their hand, essentially, help them along instead of just standing on or sitting on our state boxes and lecturing about the way things should be.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. That's amazing, and I appreciate you sharing your journey with us as well. Maria, I wonder if you might speak about some of the kind of non-traditional supports and employment models that you've been researching in this space and how they are some creative non-traditional solutions.
Thank you, Kelsey. Look, I just preempted by saying it's not easy, right? If we had a silver bullet, we would have fixed it all by now. And you've mentioned briefly regulation before, and regulation is important. It can make sure an organization has a disability action plan and it reports against the targets that sets that bar, the floor, and it matters. But I've never had a person with disability telling me, my life changed because my organization's KPI was met. Their lives change when the whole ecosystem around them, schools, families, employers, funders, universities, service providers, chooses to redesign work with them, not just for them. So there is that co-creation, co-design element. And we do know that there is enough evidence to suggest that customized employment and job carving can work really well because roles then shaped around strengths of each individual. But that kind of redesign takes time and trust and support. So it's often isn't built into the standard practice. But there are some really interesting programs and examples coming up that we can take as a good illustration of how it may work and some good innovative solutions put in place. So programs like Project Search and similar customized employment models, they now, instead of doing their small pieces in isolation, they're actually tackling that issue as a partnership between the host organization, the disability employment specialists or job coaches, and the young person, the carers, their family. And we're all working together around that shared point of real sustained employment and transition into the open employment, open labor market. So innovation isn't just a clever curriculum or yet another policy document. It's the host organization having to also agree to open up the internal workings, rosters, looking into job descriptions, workflows, so roles can be carved and created around the actual business needs and the strengths of each young person or each individual with disability. So instead of saying we'll comply with equal opportunity law and be open to applicants with disabilities, they're effectively saying we will rethink how work is organized here in collaboration with educators, families, job coaches, and young people themselves, so we can ensure meaningful, sustainable employment into long term. And that's the ecosystem move, not the single actor move that we need to be talking about.
Thanks, Maria. I think it's really important to just to note that Project Search, for example, one of the programs that you're looking at have a young person with disability employed as part of their core team. So it's not just a transitional employment program. They are really acting on the principles and trying to lead by example. And that's, I think, one of the most enjoyable parts of our job is getting to work with Lily. So thanks for mentioning that. Poppy, I might come to you now to hear about some of the innovative work going on in kind of tech and design and community sport.
Yeah, I've got a couple of really exciting examples. One of these examples is my work on Vision for Motion app, which we co-designed with people that have visual impairment to access sports online. So we use creative technology and human-centered design to build an entirely new way for people with visual impairment to engage with physical activity and community sport and connect. So the app includes audio-guided workouts on Pilates, yoga, strength and agility sessions ranging from beginners all the way to advanced, with high contrast interfaces and personalized navigation support, and a social sharing space where users can reflect on their experiences. None of that came from a policy mandate or requirement. It came from listening to people with disability and designing for what they actually needed. And it's at the early stages at the moment, but the impact that we see coming through from the minimal viable product and the testing that we did on 15 individuals is far greater than any regulation could have achieved. So the users feel independent, confident, they're able to be active on their own terms. It reduces reliance on carers. It lowers their anxiety about unfamiliar spaces and how am I going to get there. It creates a genuine sense of community. And the biggest risk for us was stepping away from that traditional sport delivery model and putting control directly in the hands of users. What a wonderful opportunity to do that. So letting them shape the features, the content, and even the language of the app, and they can even upload their own videos. And so that required flexibility, that required some willingness to challenge how sport is normally delivered. But the reward is extraordinary. Similarly, I work with the NRL, National Rugby League, on the League Ability program. It's a program for people with disabilities, intellectual or physical, and we designed an online education program for coaches and administrators so that they can expand that program across different clubs at this stage in Queensland and New South Wales. And hopefully with some funding that we are applying for, we could make it an actual national league ability program. And our research has showed how much economic and social impact this program generates and how these players build so much confidence that they transition to employability and normalcy, whether it's applying for a job, whether it's going back out on the dating scene, hanging out with their friends again, catching a bus, doing things that we think normal and easy, but to these people could be a huge barrier to confront. So yeah, these are a couple of examples that had extraordinary impact across the board.
Thanks, Poppy. It's really interesting to hear about the differences of what's happening in different fields. I wonder, Brad, if we could quickly get you to touch on an example of creative or innovative solutions that you've seen.
Yep. Great. Thank you for the opportunity. I'm going to go rogue for 30 seconds, I promise. We need to understand the scale of the Olympics and the Paralympics coming up. The Paralympics, which is the smaller of the two events, is 9 times the scale of the Commonwealth Games that we held on the Gold Coast. And that's the small one. Another random fact, more people with disabilities attended and participated in the Olympics than the Paralympics. Yep, that's right. But a lot of the time in policy and even in community, everyone just connects people with disabilities over there for the Paralympics. There's opportunities, there's trainers and others. Now, I was really fortunate to be on the ground in Paris during the recent games, and it was tough. And by tough, I mean the built environment wasn't built for people like me. Even in the stadiums, there were issues. I then went down to Barcelona. Awesome. One of the most accessible, pretty much now recognised one of the most accessible cities in the world. The public transport, their attitudes. When I attended, I got to meet with the council and others, and I knew something was wrong because they went not overboard, but I mean, people were clamouring to get my attention, to want to meet with me and talk with me. It actually got to the point where one of them actually came out and said, Brad, It's been 20 years since Barcelona Games, but in that 20 years, we've had people from all over the globe come and visit us to see what we did. You're the first person with a disability that's here to sit at the table. It was powerful. It took my breath away, but it also brought home to me that employment is important, but so is promotion post the employment. We need to give people with disabilities the opportunity to grow in those roles and become managers, so that when I sit at meetings like I did as a senior executive for 20 years, that I see someone that looks like me across the table. It is scary going into employment, and I think one of the questions I saw online about I'm afraid to participate or because I don't want to have a stereotype. Absolutely. And that's not unique to disability. We've got young people struggling with the same thing, and indeed many of our older citizens. So I think they're the challenges we've got going forward, but I think the evidence is there, but it's now less than 6 years till we have hundreds of thousands of people from around the globe with disabilities rocking up into Queensland, into Australia. That is going to be life-changing for us, our children, but also the built environment.
Thanks, Brad, and thanks for answering Casey's question. I do want to get into questions in the chat, so if you haven't posted one, please feel free to do so now. And I wonder, Lisa, if you also wanted to respond to Casey's question, which says, as a person with disability, I'm scared to go into employment because sometimes I need lengthy times off work or start the job and realize I can't continue as much as I want to work. I'm terrified of fulfilling a negative stereotype. Do you have any thoughts on how to overcome this?
Firstly, I'm not sure you have to necessarily overcome your impairment, condition, disability, neurodivergence, whatever word you want to use. I do have sympathy though, because having been in the employment sector and facing the bias and everything that goes with it, it's not a lot of fun. What I personally had to do, I can only speak from my own experience, is that traditional working models weren't for me anymore. So the 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, or in the advertising agencies, it was 9 to 9. So basically I had to look at being self-employed instead and get a bit creative with my employment options. And that is also what I've found, speaking with a lot of people in the disability community. We've had to get creative in terms of how we structure our work. Now, we shouldn't have to do that. It's a shame that we have to do that, because it would be wonderful if, like the first question you asked, what does an inclusive society look like? It would be great if universal design was just implemented across our workplaces, but that was personally what I did to overcome that problem.
Thanks, Lisa. I want to go to the next question, which is from Lisa Winnan, and they've mentioned it feels like the systemic lack of inclusion and accessibility in education and schools manifests into a society where exclusion is the norm. Interested in your thoughts on the education system and what their responsibility is in the big picture of inclusion and accessibility. And I want to open up to all of our panel members if anyone's got a particular response to that. I'm sure, Brad, you have lots of thoughts. So I might suggest we start with you, and then everyone else feel free to jump in.
That's great. And look, part of that challenge you're talking about is around workforce is really difficult, because when people talk about facing barriers to get to work, people go, that's okay, we'll organise for you to work from home. That's great, except I'm then so segregated from my workplace. I'm not physically present. I think there's a real challenge as to we give the flexibility to everyone like we do for everyone else in terms of who's normally in the workplace. So I think that's the case, but also this is a really difficult issue. Many of us will remember the Royal Commission that went through and spent 3 years, some horrendous stories, and again, acknowledging the people that have come before us. But when it came to education, they actually couldn't get to a landing because there was the people who wanted a separate system for their sons and daughters to keep them safe but also others who just wanted to be embedded because the society couldn't form both. That's really difficult, and I think there are some wicked problems in life, and I think this is part of the challenge is let's get some wins on the board. And I think how we can actually work with employers is really, really important, and also build people with disability through mentorship programs and peer supports and others to give them that confidence.
Thanks, Brad. Yeah, I think that's really important. And one of the biggest challenges from my perspective from the education system is this tension around inclusion, mainstreaming, and really visibility is the best thing that we can provide to our children and young people growing up with people with disability. Exactly what you mentioned in the beginning, Brad, coming up through the system together. And really, in order to do that, we need to think about training and education for our educators, who often, are if you're in Queensland, you know that our teachers have been on strike, and some of the things they're calling out for are better education training and support around inclusive practice. So I think there's a lot of work to be done in that space, but it is a critical enabler for change. Did any of our other panel members want to jump in to respond to Lisa's question about the education system and their responsibility for inclusion, or should we move on to the next question? Okay. The next question is from Monique Lewis, who asks, this one's definitely for you, Lisa. What role do you feel the news media plays in how disability is understood and experienced in Australia and beyond? And what future actions, not just in the news media space, are needed to improve inclusivity? So, pop culture, forms of advertising, etc. So I think we'll start with you, Lisa. I just can't hear you. I'm not sure if anyone else can. So we'll come back to you. In the meantime, Poppy, I wonder if you could address some of the kind of social media interesting campaigns. I think Leagueability is an interesting one, and some of that social sharing that you've talked about, and where there might be some things that could be done in this kind of media space.
What's the actual question?
It said, what role do you feel that the media plays in how disability is understood and experienced, and what's needed to improve inclusivity, kind of in that pop culture, news media, advertising space?
Yeah, I think the media has come a long way to shape or reshape people's perception of disability, and how empowering it can be. Social media in particular, we see a lot of athletes or individuals with disability using that as a feature of their personality that empowers them. And so they're using, look, I have a disability, and it doesn't stop me from being successful. It doesn't stop me from being happy. And they have a lot of followers. And so the era of social media has created a huge influence and impact and understanding of people with living disabilities. And I think we see that in sports. We see that in other spheres in life. For example, a lot of Nike campaigns, they use athletes or individuals at grassroots levels with disabilities to send a message to society and to people with disability that you can do it. And so forth. So I think the influence and impact of social media as a catalyst to shaping society norms and acceptance and understanding issues around disability has been tremendous over the past decade.
Thanks, Poppy. We are getting close to end of time, and so I just want to kind of reorient what we've talked about today. You know, we really talked about the vision and the idea that this inclusive society is, you know, really critical and built on dignity, expectancy, and seamless access, where inclusion is standard practice and not an add-on. And we talked about the barriers and our greatest roadblocks being stigma and that imagination gap, and systems that reward quick fixes over sustained participation and growth. And then we've heard from the panel about the most effective ways forward through innovation and critically co-creation and co-design, designing solutions with people with disability driven by trust and sustained support. I wonder, this relates to Emily's question. So thank you, Emily. If in closing, each of our panelists could mention the single kind of most important action that our audience members can take today to start addressing inclusion in their own sphere of influence, whether that's their team, their school, their local club, their family, what might that concrete action, practical action be? And it looks like Lisa's had to drop off the call. So Maria, will come to you first.
No worries, Kelsey. I'll tackle this question yet again with my head of employment workforce lens. As we're looking ahead, you know, in the context of 2032 Brisbane Olympics and Paralympics Games, we have genuinely one in a lifetime here, once in a generation, not lifetime rather, but opportunity. There will be plenty of new roles across tourism, events, hospitality, transport. So there is infrastructure, there's opportunity here and now to build flexibility and inclusion into those jobs, rather than making an afterthought. So if there is that little nugget, I would say to everyone who's hiring, redesign one role this year with a person with disability in mind, but do so, and to Emily's point, perhaps by getting closer and with intent to listen on purpose, not in a tokenistic way, but actively seeking out disability voices as colleagues, advisors, co-researchers, but paying attention to and paying them for that expertise and making decisions accordingly.
Thanks, Maria. Poppy, we'll go to you next. So one piece of practical advice for how people can start to make change in their own sphere of influence.
For me, it would be this: ask people with disability what they need and then act on it. We've had enough assumptions. We don't need more assumptions. We need more conversation. And I'm just gonna close with the Brisbane 2032. We need to act on the Games as being a catalyst for long-term, broader change. We have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to not just to run an accessible Games, but to build an accessible Queensland. And if we treat the Games as a starting point rather than the finishing line, we can redesign communities, sport, transport, workplaces, public spaces, so that people with disability experience real inclusion long after the closing ceremony. That's my thoughts.
Thanks, Poppy. And Brad, we'll end with you. Thanks.
Yep. I think part of the challenge, and this is a bit of a personal one as well, is people with disabilities are a very diverse church. We all have very, very different needs, and part of this is about understanding other different types of disability, so that when we are advocating for accessibility for me, that we're not inadvertently excluding someone else. And that's
Thank you. Thanks, Brad. And I just want to say special thank you to our panel for your insights today and for sharing so honestly with us about your experiences. And of course, thank you to Millie and Makarla, Joe, Beck, Rosie for all of your great organization of this event. And I will just hand back to Millie.
Thank you, Kelsey, and thank you, panel. On behalf of the Griffith Equity, Inclusion and Diversity Committee, the Hopkins Centre and Inclusive Futures Reimagining Disability, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. We note that there are some questions we didn't get to, and we will send through a follow-up email when we have a recording available, and if we have an opportunity to address any of those questions, we'll do so via that medium. Thank you very much for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.